So this is a presentation that basically is sharing what we initiated 2 years ago, which was basically this research on post-disaster urban responses. And while the poster, which was communicated, said that we would be talking about the Sichuan workshop, which we just finished in July, August, that's not the case. So we will be doing the Sichuan studio in probably in about 2 months or so. We'll be able to present that work. So what I'm presenting now is the research that we did following the interest which was instigated basically by two things. One, on the 12th of May 2008, there was a huge earthquake in a region which was not really earthquake prone. It was not really an expected earthquake, which was kind of interesting because it's not a region that has had an earthquake for the last hundreds of years. So it was very odd to have this quite high intense magnitude earthquake, which caused a major catastrophe to the region of Sichuan province. And as you can see here already, some of the numbers mix depending on which agency you're getting the numbers from, but basically it was quite catastrophic. And the thing that hit us in the beginning, although this number has been shifted since then, is the fact that at that moment we understood that about 19,000 students of school had actually passed away. The number now is more around 6,000 to 8,000, once again depending on which agency you're asking. So this happened on the 12th of May 2008. On the 13th of May of 2008, one day later, there was another disaster, which was, what disaster much closer to home, which was the fire which burned down our previous faculty. And yeah, a big day, of course, for us, that suddenly something, such a big impact could come to something that we thought was so well organized, well structured, well organized. That it's not that these things happen only in places where things are not well thought through, but actually very close to home, we can also have quite intense moments. So we decided to say, and this has a call of students, so we had a whole lot of Chinese students that said, hey, we had this big disaster back home, what can we do? And that was one thing. And then we had other students who were basically coming from Dutch students and just other students in the faculty from architecture that said, hey, there's been this big disaster back in our home, what can we do about it? Is there anything that we can actually do to respond to this kind of architectural catastrophe? So together with that, we said we're going to focus on this issue of disasters and start to put together, a research initiative, I'll call it. We basically had to think about what is going to be our parameters, because there are a lot of things to focus on once you get into this world. So the first thing that we said is that we're going to deal with natural disasters. So we're not going to deal with post-conflict areas. So no areas where there's a war, no area where there's no political will to change it. So we needed to make sure that that was one of the things. One, because this was important for us to be able to do our field research, that we had safe environments and a support mechanism locally. And two, because we wanted to do research and also contribute it to organizations that somehow will do something with it. And if there's a war going on, then it becomes very difficult to deal with these kind of issues. Secondly, we said that we're going to be dealing with developing countries. So developing countries, although this word is a little bit ambiguous, developing regions, you can also call it, but states that are in a high force of development, because we didn't want to deal with a place like New Orleans. We did that in 2006, or with something that happened recently in Italy. But in developing countries, the dependency on foreign aid and foreign money and foreign influence is the greatest, which was the second key factor. The third key factor is that we wanted to deal with the relatively recent disasters. We didn't want to look at the disaster 35 years ago to find out what the urban environment is now like. What we really wanted to say is how can we go and deal with disaster so that when we're doing this fieldwork we can actually start interviewing and talking to people about who've been part of this disaster. Whether as someone who's been inflicted by it or as a beneficiary, or someone that is on the other side actually has been part of the reorganization and the reconstruction. So these were basically the three parameters, and then we thought, okay, another issue that we wanted to look at is who's being affected. Who's really the big organization or body of human presence that is being affected. Now, this 2007 slum report from the UN Habitat basically said that there were 1.1 billion slummers by 2010. They also said that by 2020 we'll have about 2.0 billion slummers worldwide. Now, these are the people that are being highly affected. These are the people who are actually, in these very vulnerable spaces of the city, which normally the city does not inhabit, but are being inhabited by people who are there for several different reasons, which we wanted to go and discover. But we wanted to question this issue of this being this 1.1 billion slummers, because at the same time, also this number also shifts depending on who you're asking. We understand that there are about 800 million Chinese farmers who are living in an economic situation that are not really very much different than those people living inside the city, who are then called slums. Secondly, there are 450 million African farmers who are also living in a very deprived economic situation, that are also struggling for some kind of benefit and some kind of, potentially we can call them people who might not become economic migrants or economic refugees to the city. And thirdly, we've got 130 million Latin farmers who are also dealing and struggling with a very strong economic force that is working from outside. So if you put this together, the question is, maybe we don't have 1.1 now, but we actually maybe potentially have 2.4 billion slummers. So this was a real wake-up call to say, hey, there's an issue of focus here, which is covering almost 50% of the world. And we have to start really thinking about this issue. And we didn't know exactly how we're going to engage in it, but we knew that it had a high urgency to it. So based on those parameters, we said, okay, we're going to be dealing with the southern half of the world, and put together what was called a divergent research. We didn't want to put a research that says, we're only going to focus on earthquakes, with this kind of scenario, this kind of condition, and find out, and we have a comparative study on earthquake responses all over the world. No, we were setting up a research and we said, we want to know what's happening, who's part of this world, what are the effects, what kind of decisions are being made, how does that have a spatial transformation to the urban fabric? And that was really the kind of key question. So the research choices of locations were very divergent, so that we could see, just to see what's going on, and based on this we could make a future decision on how we can continue with this kind of research. So we took areas and locations in Venezuela, El Salvador, Ghana, Bangladesh, Philippines, and Indonesia. So these basically became our 6 case studies, which all have different types of disasters, different types of frequencies, different kind of impacts, and different kind of response mechanisms to them. So from that, we basically looked at, okay, what are actually the key factors that we're looking at? And there are a couple of, let's say, comparative aspects that we could look into. I'm just going to give me 1 second just to check something. Okay, so we had a couple of, when people actually came back, there were a couple of, let's say, general themes that we found relevant that became a kind of a comparative framework. And one of them that we looked at was impact, basically looking at risk and vulnerability. So just as far as determining a couple of terminologies that are being used in this disaster response world. This, of course, was important for us because we're coming as architects and urbanists with our sciences, but there's a world in this, a long existing world that has been dealing with post-disaster since 1960 as a kind of formalized international organization that has also its own language, it has its own codes. And interestingly enough, when you actually go and do the research into the handbooks and guidebooks that are being used, most of this is being done, and most of the research that has been done before, and most of, let's say, the conditions that are being put forward are by people who grew up themselves in, let's say, Western America, suburban London or suburban England, who have a concept of space and a concept of living which is highly suburban.